complaints, secret agreements, and a highly suspicious engine. This week I'm chatting all about the 2019 Ferrari engine in another episode of Weird and Wonderful F1. So get ready, because you've been summoned to the Steward's office. Hello everyone, and welcome back to the Steward's office. I'm Saira, and this week we are back with another episode of Weird and Wonderful F1. These are some of my favourite podcast episodes to do because I love delving into the different stories that have happened in Formula One. Some are ones that I know about, some are ones that have just been brought to my attention or I've heard about in passing, and I wanted to share those stories with you guys. And by the looks of it, when I look at some of the stats on my episodes, the Weird and Wonderful F1 episodes tend to do pretty well, so I'm hoping you guys do actually enjoy them as well. This story, however, has to be one of my favourites in Formula One. Maybe one of my favourites isn't the perfect wording for this, but it is a story that I just find so fascinating. And when I first heard about this, it's got to be 2021 when I actually started watching Formula One. I wanted to figure out what had gone on and what had happened. So it's one of the most interesting cases for me in recent F1 history, at least. And yeah, some of you might already know about this story, but it is about the 2019 Ferrari engine. I've got to be honest, I'm still not entirely sure what I'm going to be calling this episode yet. Engine Gate, Fuel Flow Gate, the hypothetical illegal Ferrari engine of 2019. I'm not entirely sure. But this was one of the biggest stories, I think, when it came to teams and potential cheating in recent Formula One history. So let's delve into it. A lot of this story does centre around 2019 and the 2019 F1 season. However, we are going to start in 2018 to get a full grasp on what went on. So Ferrari had gone into this 2018 F1 season with a pretty good car. And that in itself, I wouldn't say is anything to raise an eyebrow at. However, it made quite a big leap compared to the previous year. So it had raised a couple of eyebrows as to how it had gotten so much better, how it had made this big leap in performance. Now, this was the type of performance jump that had made all the teams kind of suspicious and wonder what was going on. And in particular, it really made Red Bull and Mercedes suspicious. Now, bear in mind, this was still that massive era of dominance for Mercedes. We were still at a point in time in Formula One where they were winning races, where the car was super strong. And yeah, you were really just trying to beat the Mercedes car on a race weekend when you went to a Grand Prix. Now, the suspicions that in particular Mercedes and Red Bull had, but also the other teams, weren't really centered on the aero package of the car. It was more the inner mechanics of it, the power that the car was actually getting more than the airflow that it was creating around the car. Now, what the teams had been thinking and what media outlets were reporting was that Ferrari had something like a dual battery setup in their car. What a dual battery setup would allow Ferrari to do is to go over the energy limits, and that wasn't something that was allowed. And if it was, all the teams would have been doing it at this point. So there was a lot of noise about this. Like I said, media outlets picking up on this, the teams were raising eyebrows and talking about this. And by the time we got to Monaco in 2018, which was the sixth race of the season, the FIA decided that they were going to have to do something about this. They were going to have to do something about the complaints because, let's be honest, one, this isn't a good look for Formula One to have a team like Ferrari being accused of cheating. But also on top of that, if they thought there was something there, it was better off just to investigate it. And then, yeah, if there was nothing wrong, leave it be. And if there was, they could at least do something about it. So by Monaco, they decided they were going to do something. So what the FIA decided to do to try and put all of these rumours and suspicions at rest is put a second sensor on what people thought was this second battery. So what this extra sensor that the FIA had put on the Ferrari car was going to do was measure if there was any extra energy output. If there was, then yes, they were definitely in breach of the rules and it was something that they were going to have to further investigate. And if not, then that was fine. In the end, the race director at the time, who was the late Charlie Whiting, had turned around and denied that Ferrari was doing anything illegal with this apparent dual battery. He said, nope, they're not using a dual battery setup like everyone thinks they are. And then later on in the season, what they saw was Ferrari's performance started to peter off. It wasn't as strong as it was at the beginning of the year. And once again, this raised a lot of suspicions because it's funny how the performance went down after you were monitoring more closely about an apparent dual battery. But once again, Charlie Whiting said, nope, that's nothing to do with a dual battery. That's not the reason why. No real answer as to how Ferrari started off so strong and then the performance sort of fell away. FIA was saying, no, we checked and there's no dual battery, and that was it for 2018. But that didn't end because then we started to get into 2019 and the rumours did not end, even though the FIA had thought, we put an end to this now. We investigated and we didn't find anything. That has never ever stopped the rumour mill in and around Formula One, let's be honest. So like I said, we went into the 2019 season and Australia, which was the season opener at the time, was not a great race for Ferrari. They didn't start off the season very well. And when you looked at the areas where they were losing a lot of time to their competitors, it was down the straights and around the corners. But then they headed out to the Bahrain Grand Prix and suddenly the Ferrari looked a lot stronger. Funnily enough though, the strength in that car came from their straight line speed. And it made no sense that there was this sudden jump in performance. Australia was where they were struggling the most with straight line speed. It was one of the places they were losing the most time. But yet they got to Bahrain and suddenly they're one of the strongest teams when it comes to straight line speed. Now, when the teams headed out to Canada in 2019, which was around the 7th race of the season, so, you know, that F1 season was well and truly going, there were more suspicions raised about Ferrari and more questions being asked. Teams were really questioning at this point what was the level of power that Ferrari were able to get out of their power unit because they'd seemed so strong so suddenly. And Renault, who were on the grid at the time before they became Alpine, said that they were surprised at the performance that Ferrari managed to get out of their PU. That was only the beginning though, because there was even more speculation after the summer break in 2019. Now bear in mind, even though Ferrari had seemed to be stronger on the straights really suddenly after Australia, they hadn't managed a race win in the first half of the season. The car was stronger, but they hadn't actually managed to win any races. After summer break though, Ferrari had managed back-to-back race wins. Now these were also Charles Leclerc's first ever race wins. It was he wins in Spa, he wins at Monza, that beautiful line from Crofty. But those were the first wins that Ferrari had for the 2019 season after having a drought of wins in the first half of the season. And once again, this raised a lot of eyebrows because not only have you now won a race, but you're winning back-to-back races. You're winning back-to-back races against Mercedes, who, like I said, were the dominant team at the time. This wasn't the norm in Formula One, that Ferrari would be able to win back-to-back races, especially after not showing that level of performance in the first half of the season. And look, you're probably thinking, you know what? Teams can bring upgrades. That's not illegal, and it wasn't legal at the time either. Teams brought upgrades. Ferrari had brought upgrades to the car. We've seen that sort of performance jump with teams like McLaren last season and this season, where they've brought a massive upgrades package to the car, and it has massively helped their race pace. However, GPS data from Monza ended up showing that the advantage that Ferrari was getting was not from aerodynamics, but from power. Their advantage on straight line speed just wasn't coming from the aerodynamics of the car, it was coming from power and therefore the power unit. Now, when people looked at that GPS data, Ferrari were getting an advantage of up to a second on straight line speed. And that is absolutely insane to me. Now, Formula One and any kind of motorsport really is all down to fine margins, right? To have a team, especially at this point in that era of regulations, right, where the teams had settled down into them, they were used to them, they had learned how to get the strongest car, what design was going to help and everything, right? It was strange. It didn't make sense that Ferrari would be able to get nearly a second advantage on straight line speed. And once again, especially after not starting off the season all that strong, not getting a win, you come into the second half of the season, back-to-back wins, and you nearly have a second advantage on straight line speed. Definitely made some eyebrows raise around the paddock. Now, Toto Wolff, when he spoke to the media, thought that the Ferrari engine was around 50 horsepower ahead of all the other engine manufacturers, and that all the other manufacturers were sort of playing in the same ballpark, which is quite competitive with each other, but Ferrari just had this massive advantage with horsepower. Christian Horner, however, said during the Belgian Grand Prix weekend that his team had gone and submitted basically a complaint to the FIA about wanting to know what was going on with Ferrari, but he was yet to hear from the FIA at that point. By the time we headed out to the US Grand Prix in November, so we were really at the end of the season at this point, the FIA had put out a new technical directive. They basically said that any subversive tactics around tricking the fuel sensor was going to be illegal. It wasn't allowed, so that was a new technical directive that had been put out. Now, this was down to the fact that the rumours and accusations surrounding Ferrari at this point was down to fuel and fuel rate and fuel consumption of their car. The accusations were now saying that Ferrari had managed to somehow exceed the fuel flow rate limit between the two measurements that the FIA were taking on the cars, right? Increasing that fuel rate meant that the engine was getting more power, meaning that, yeah, on things like straight line speed, they could be quicker. And that's what was giving them this advantage really quickly that nobody could understand how it came about in the first place. What the thinking was at this point was that they were passing an electrical current through the fuel sensors that the FIA mandated, and that would then allow excess fuel to be used, once again giving the engine more power. So that was what the theory that a lot of people had come up with to explain how Ferrari had gotten the advantage that they had. So this technical directive came out ahead of the US Grand Prix, and people made comments on it about why it had come about in the first place. Max Verstappen made a comment on it, and Ferrari was still denying that anything had happened. However, the suspicions that were raised on Ferrari were not helped by the fact that the technical directive came out, and in the US Grand Prix, Ferrari ended up having a car retire and another car finish in 4th place. So you can kind of imagine that that was not going to help their plight here. People were really thinking, you know what, the technical directive came out and suddenly the car is not doing too great. There's got to be a reason behind that. The FIA, though, weren't just stopping at a technical directive. Now, before the Abu Dhabi Grand Prix, the season closer, the FIA said that it was seizing one of the Ferrari engines and doing an investigation and analysis on it. There was also a fuel discrepancy that was found on Charles Leclerc's car, and because of that, the team got fined 50,000 euros. However, Ferrari came out of this season still saying that they never cheated, they stayed within the regulations, everything that the car was doing, the aerodynamics, the engine, everything was all within the regulations that the FIA had set out. They weren't admitting to anything. They weren't saying they had done anything wrong. That's where 2019 ended. People still being highly suspicious of Ferrari, and Ferrari saying, we've done nothing wrong. So we head into the 2020 season and we get into winter testing, and it's going on, it's fine, you know, rumours still circling around, but the cars are on track and they're running. Up until the very last session of winter testing, when the FIA decided to drop a statement. And basically what the statement had said is that a settlement had been reached between the FIA and Ferrari about its power unit last season. They did say that the details of the settlement were going to be confidential. They weren't saying anything. They didn't say that Ferrari had cheated, that the engine was illegal, that there were issues with the fuel flow rate, nothing like that. They had said, you know what, we're keeping the settlement under wraps and it's staying confidential. They did say that there had been an investigation into the engine. This wasn't just coming up out of nowhere, and also that both parties had agreed to measures to have closer monitoring of all power units in Formula One. A couple of days after the statement from the FIA, all of the other F1 teams released a statement. And the only teams that didn't sign off on this statement were obviously Ferrari and any Ferrari affiliated teams, so teams that were using Ferrari parts or their engine. And I don't think it will be a surprise to anyone at all to find out that in this statement, all of the other F1 teams were really not happy. Essentially, they were threatening legal action against the FIA over this confidential agreement that they had reached with Ferrari. And that was because they said that there was a lack of transparency here. You've got to remember, right, a lot of these teams had raised suspicions, raised queries, had spoken to the media since 2018 about the fact that they thought there was something up with that Ferrari engine, something suspicious. They might not have known exactly what, but they had their suspicions. It had been investigated by Charlie Whiting as race director, the PU had got him for investigation, and all of that had been done. And with the Charlie Whiting statement, he had said there was no dual engine, but you weren't giving the teams an answer, and they were upset about that. They wanted to know what was going on. They wanted transparency on this matter. They wanted to know whether the Ferrari car in 2019 was legal the entire way through the season or not. And if it was legal, then why were you in a settlement agreement with Ferrari? Because there would be no need for that if the car had fit all of the regulations and parameters required of it. Ferrari refused to comment on anything further than what the FIA statement had said. They weren't going to step a foot out of line with this one. Whatever the FIA had said was what they were telling the media themselves. They weren't making an extra comment on this at all. The FIA, however, did reply a couple of days after the teams had put out that statement threatening legal action. Now, what the FIA had said is that they weren't comfortable with how Ferrari had operated its power unit in 2019. They didn't say it was outside the regulations, they didn't say it was illegal, but they just said that they weren't comfortable. But on top of that, what they did say is that they were well within their rights to have this confidential settlement with Ferrari. There was no need for them to make what that settlement was, what those discussions were, public for everyone, for even the teams to see, right? They had every legal right to keep that confidential between the FIA and Ferrari. And that's where the matter left off. Because the FIA had a point, the teams couldn't really do anything about the fact that this was a confidential matter between two parties, even though they wanted to know, even though they felt like they had the right to know what had gone on and what this settlement was. The FIA turned around and said, nope, it's confidential, and it has stayed that way. So yeah, we have never ever found out what that agreement was between Ferrari and the FIA, and we have never actually found out what the issue was with that Ferrari power unit. And don't get me wrong, yes, we have a lot of suspicions about the fuel flow rate and everything, but we've never actually had anything confirmed. We don't actually know if that really is the case, whether there was something else, something extra, or whether people were bang on the money when they said it was extra fuel flow rate that they shouldn't have had. 2021 though, like I said, when I started watching Formula One, there was speculation about what the penalty was for Ferrari, and this I clearly remember, and I think this is why I even found out about this entire story. And like I said, this really is just speculation. We still don't know for sure. But essentially what it has sounded like is that the FIA didn't necessarily give Ferrari a financial penalty for whatever the heck went on with that engine, right? They might have, but that wasn't the only thing as far as we have speculated here, and as far as people have kind of tried to figure out. What people think did happen and what was part of the settlement was that they were going to have to run in 2020 with less fuel for the engine, and that would not just be them, but all of their customer teams. So that included at the time Alfa Romeo and Haas, who were also using the Ferrari engine. They were all going to have to use less fuel in the 2020 season, which meant, yes, they weren't going to be as quick, they were going to have to be more fuel effective, and there wasn't going to be as much power going through the engine. And part of the reason that this rumour came up was because in 2020, Ferrari had the worst ever year in 40 years. They ended up finishing in P6 in the Constructors' Championship, worst result in 40 years, which is what led a lot of people to believe that, yeah, they've had to run less fuel in 2020 because their customer teams really weren't doing great either. So yeah, that is something that would definitely account for the massive drop in performance that they did end up having in 2020. But that is just speculation. Like I said, the FIA and Ferrari have never come out and said anything about it, and I don't think they ever will. Ferrari definitely won't. And I don't think the FIA will either. Whatever was in that agreement, in that settlement, whatever the discussions were between Ferrari and the FIA at the time, I don't think we're ever going to fully know what went on there. Don't get me wrong, I would absolutely love to know what happened. I think a lot of us would. I'd love to know what the penalty was or what the settlement agreement was, and I would really love to know what went on with that engine, because once again, it was never said that it was illegal outside the regulations. It was just the FIA saying that they weren't really happy with the way Ferrari had ran their engine in 2019. So was it a grey area in the regulations that the FIA thought, you know what, this doesn't feel very sportsmanlike, which is why technical directives and everything came out to clamp down on those issues? Was it a mistake that maybe started out as a mistake and they were like, you know what, doesn't matter, we'll just carry on? Or was it something that they really did on purpose? I wish I knew, but I don't think I'm ever going to. What I do understand though was the aggravation and the anger and disappointment from the teams, right? Whilst it was completely within the FIA's legal rights not to make that information public and to have a confidential agreement between the FIA and Ferrari, I do get why the teams would want to know, especially when they had been raising complaints for about 1.5 to 2 years about Ferrari and their engine, and when everything came to a head, they just found out nothing about it really. So that is another episode on weird and wonderful F1, and I would say this is more on the weird side compared to wonderful. If there are F1 stories that you think are weird and or wonderful, please let me know. Drop me a comment or a message on my socials or a comment on the YouTube video or anything like that, because I love finding out about this sort of stuff, or I love being able to tell you guys about it if I do already know about it. I will be back next Tuesday with a Canadian Grand Prix review because yes, it is race week again. Heading out to Canada before we get back to Europe for the European leg of the season, and I quite like Canada. I really do like the circuit. Kind of reminds me of the street circuit, and I love having all of the trees and everything hang over, so it is a nice circuit. I like them going out there. Lance Stroll's home Grand Prix, so I'm sure he's going to be hoping for a very strong result. It's a happy hunting ground for Lewis Hamilton, or it has been in the past at least, so he's probably hoping for a good set of results there. We have Red Bull, who are definitely going to want to bounce back from Monaco and put things right and open up the championship lead again. And we're going to see how Ferrari and McLaren do. Can they keep up the performance? What's going on with them? Can they keep up with Red Bull if Red Bull are back at the front? I'm hoping we get different winners again, though. I'm hoping we get some good battles for pole and a good battle for the race lead and up and down the entire grid. I hope we see all 20 drivers having a good battle, because as much as I loved watching Charles Leclerc win Monaco, the one thing we were sorely lacking were battles across the field in Monaco. We just didn't have overtakes. So I am looking forward to some more wheel-to-wheel racing, hopefully out in Canada. So join me next Tuesday at 9 a.m. for that episode. Thank you guys so much for listening. Anti Alcambara. Make sure you follow me on TikTok and Instagram at stewards_office for more motorsport content. And I will see you guys the next time you're summoned to the Steward's office.